Fantrax Fantasy Football starts of the week for Week 11. Brock Purdy faces the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who allow the fifth most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks and the second most passing yards per game this season. Purdy has finished as a top 12 quarterback in back-to-back weeks and 5 times this year. Week 10 was his best fantasy week. He threw 19 for 26 for 296 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. Purdy threw 365 passing yards back in Week 8. He's thrown a 70% plus completion percentage in 5 games, and he's thrown multiple touchdowns in 4 games this season. And everybody's healthy in San Francisco. Jerome Ford faces the Pittsburgh Steelers, who allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 8th most rushing yards per game this season. This is the second matchup between the Cleveland Browns and the Pittsburgh Steelers. Back in Week 2, Nick Chubb rushed 10 times for 64 yards before sustaining that season-ending injury to his knee. This meant Jerome Ford stepping into the lead back role. He rushed 16 times for 106 yards. He also scored a receiving touchdown in this game, finishing as the running back 6, Week 2 against the Steelers. Ford finishes the running back 7 the very next week. He also finishes the running back 10 in Week 7. Now that Ford is healthy, it's less and less of a committee in Cleveland. He's played 64% of the snaps the last 2 weeks. He caught 5 passes in Week 9, then rushed for 107 yards in Week 10, 25, and then 18 touches the last 2 weeks, separating himself from Kareem Hunt. Devin Singletary faces the Cardinals, who allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 5th most rushing yards per game this season. Dameon Pierce missed Weeks 9 and 10. It looks like he's going to miss Week 11 as well. Devin Singletary had a big Week 10. He rushed 30 times for 150 yards and a touchdown. 31 touches last week was amazing volume. And he made the most of it and has a great matchup this week. If this isn't a Tony Pollard week, then I don't know if there ever will be one. He faces the Panthers, who allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 7th most rushing yards per game this season. Pollard has finished as the running back 5, running back 11, and running back 11 in 3 weeks, but then he's finished as the running back 26 or worse in 5 games. He has played 64+% of the snaps in all but 1 game this year. He had a 122 rushing yard day back in Week 3. He's finished 2 weeks with 6 or more catches. He's the lead back in a great offense in a smash matchup, so fingers crossed for a Tony Pollard week. Davante Adams faces the Miami Dolphins, who allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. Listen, it's been a rough year for Davante Adams when it comes to his expectations and his draft capital and where he's been producing. I get that. Last week, we had a positive sign, though. He was targeted 13 times from rookie Aiden O'Connell, and he finished with 86 receiving yards. Against a powerful Miami offense, I just expect Davante Adams to be hyper-targeted in this one, which should give him an opportunity for a good day. Mike Evans faces the 49ers, who allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. After cooling off in both Weeks 8 and 9, Mike Evans finished as a top 5 fantasy wide receiver in Week 10, catching 6 of his 10 targets for 143 receiving yards and a touchdown. Week 10 marked Evans' 5th week scoring 17-plus fantasy points, 3rd week scoring over 20 fantasy points. Evans has earned 10 targets in 4 games, finished Week 2 with 171 receiving yards, and scored 6 touchdowns this season. Against the 6-3 49ers, Mike Evans' role is going to be very important. Terry McLaurin faces the Giants, who allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 12th most passing yards per game this season. McLaurin has finished as a top 20 fantasy wide receiver just 3 times this season, but what stands out to me is the target volume the last 7 games. During this span, McLaurin has been targeted 8 or more times in 6 games and 10 or more times in 3. The volume is there. He has been producing 86, 81, 90, 63, and 73 receiving yards this season, so not a massive week quite yet, but the Giants matchup presents a good opportunity for that. And then Trey McBride faces the Texans, who allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season. Trey McBride led the Cardinals last week in targets, which is significant because it was Kyler Murray's first start back in action. McBride caught 8 of those 9 targets last week for a season-high 131 receiving yards and scored 21.1 fantasy points. Back in Week 8, McBride caught 10 of 14 targets for 95 yards and a touchdown for 25.5 fantasy points. So this guy has scored over 21 fantasy points in 2 out of 3 of his last games played with 2 different quarterbacks, which means that he is just good at football. So target volume paired with receiving upside just implies that he's a great play the rest of the year and specifically this week. Follow us at Fantrax for consistent fantasy football content to help you win.